Well, like I said, this is Black History Month. How about that?
Whoop whoop.
A month set aside for us to remember our history. And you know, it used to be that you would it was like on Martin Luther King Day, where they would want you to get into the parade and march for a long time. But you know, some of that is some of, you know, you the older you get, you can't stand all that cold, you know, and you be you, you walking
they
and all
had
that.
they had a car parade this year.
They- it's right. A car parade. But see, we have to celebrate. I mean, you know, they gave us this a holiday with Martin Luther King. Then they gave us this month, Black History Month. Actually started out as Black History Week, if you remember,
Hmm.
and it grew up into Black History Month. And the wild thing about it is that it was it began with a guy, and you know, with Black History we need to always remember the people who have basically come before us and helped us with getting things done. And this happened back in the 1900s, where this trying to set aside a time or a date for us to remember our black history. And one thing about Black history is that, you know, it's something we shouldn't forget. Now, a lot of times, Black history celebrations are for our accomplishments, and we should acknowledge our accomplishments. But a lot of times, as we go through with our accomplishments, we can't forget the history. We can't forget from whence we came, from where we came, from how we came, and what has happened to us. Because they always say if you forget history, you're going to end up repeating history. So I think that's something that we definitely have to make sure that that we don't forget. And a guy that's supposedly mainly responsible for that is a historian named Carter G. Woodson, who way back in the first part of the 19th century, along with some others, uh, thought it might be appropriate for us to celebrate our achievements and so here we are, Black History Month in the United States. Now, Canada also celebrates Black History Month. You might not know recently that Ireland, the Netherlands, and the UK, of course, celebrate it, but they celebrate theirs in October. All right, but so we have Black History Month, and we need to. What do we do on Black History Month? What do you do? Do you talk to your kids about Black history? Do you let them know from whence we've come and all that? Well, as for our standing in the gap moment, we're gonna focus on, guess what? Black
Black
history.
history.
Black history, and we're gonna get into it now. We're going to celebrate some of, you know, some names, some very important people throughout our history. We're going to remember the experience of our history, because you know, a lot of people want to downgrade us as people, in that heck, we've been over here for 400 years, and look, we haven't progressed as much as everybody else. Look at the other people who've come over here, these, you know, immigrants and things like that. And it's you can't really say we were immigrants. We weren't immigrants. We were enslaved people brought over here for a purpose, a nefarious purpose. And let's not ever forget that.
You know, Sister Michelle said our history started with the beginning of time. We were in God's plans. And we need to keep in mind that that is really the truth.
It is. It is absolutely true. So let's we're gonna go this journey on this month, and we're going to remember our history. And I call it. I don't know if any of you in your English classes, as you were reading all the literary masterpieces and all that, ever heard of one called The Pride and the prejudice. I kind of look at our history as the pride and the prejudice. And only because we need to look at with pride the accomplishments that we've done and the perseverance that we have had over the years. But let's not forget the prejudice that we've had to endure over this period of time. There's no way that we can forget that, because if we forget that, we then don't understand the mechanics of what's going on even today, because racism in America, from Africa to America and slavery, and they're at the foundation of the United States. They used us to build the United States to what they call freedom in 1865, and the Jim Crow after that, to assert their white supremacy and their white privilege and all that kind of thing, and to suppress our ability to enjoy life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and for us not to or for us to ignore that in their documents it says that we are all created equal. And so building on a lie, building on hypocrisy and all that kind of thing. And I remember it was Malcom X who said that you know, as with American history, they want us to remember the Pilgrims landed on Plymouth Rock. And Malcolm said, Plymouth Rock landed on us. But as we remember the struggles, the bubbles of freedom, that every now and then we get to a point where we don't rebel, but we demand our freedom. I call it the struggle. And after 400 years, the question is, where are we? Where are we in that? How much has changed over that period of time? Like I said, let's not forget where we came from. And I've got a video here for you that you can that I want you to see as we move on. Where we come from. You know, back in I think it was the 30s or the 40s, the government initiated a project where they actually talked to and recorded statements from ex-slaves, because there were a lot that were still around, were born in slavery, were slaved, and were emancipated, and they wanted to talk to them before they all passed away, because back in the 30s they would have been quite old by then, because slavery, if you look at the Emancipation Proclamation, was in 1862. So you're talking about either 158, probably 158, because the years, well, now it would be 159 years of freedom, if you mark freedom from that day. Or you may mark it from the 13th Amendment. And but in any event, it's been over 150 years that we have been, quote unquote, free. And one thing about that history that you know, we see President Biden now is signing all these executive orders and things, and people, yeah, those executive orders don't mean anything, and you know, you got to get legislation and all that. Well, you know, to a certain extent that's true, except for I'll tell you one executive order that had a lot of significance, and it was an executive order, and it was the Emancipation Proclamation. So let's not just overlook executive orders. And but this, talking about the history of slavery that they recorded, I have a video for you, and it's stark. And this is to start us at the point of remembering and not forgetting where we've come from and what we have, what we were put through.
He have experienced the most profound effect. He was a graduate student when he interviewed the former slaves, including the two women you hear in this broadcast. Himself interviewed just before he died in 1979, Falk was going on about how he believed in giving blacks the right to go to school, giving them the right to vote, giving them the right to go into anything they qualified for. And then he said he experienced an epiphany.
I'm sitting there on a wagon tongue with this old black man, and was telling him what a different kind of white man I was. I remember him looking at me very sadly and kind of sweetly and condescending and said, "You know, you still got the disease, honey. I know you think you're cured, but you're not cured. You can't give me the right to be a human being. I'm born with that right. Now, you can keep me from having that. If you've got all the policemen and all the jobs on your side, you can deprive me of it. But you can't give it to me. And I was born with it just like you was." And my God, it had a profound effect on me. I was furious with him. But the more I reflected on it, the more profoundly it affected me. And I realized this was where it really was.
Tell you the truth, when I think of it today, I don't know how I'm living.
I remember that this is where it looked like to me, I can't.
Been slaves all our lives, and mother was a slave, and sister was a slave, father was a slave.
They know nothing about reading like that. All that I know is they teach you to mind your master and your mistress. Mama them didn't know where to go. She after she would go, just like he told some mom to go. Didn't know where to go.
They are haunting voices from the past, not actors reading a script or scholars reading a text, but the actual voices of men and women, Americans, who were born in slavery.
My name is Fountain Hughes. I was born in Charlottesville, Virginia. My grandfather belonged to Thomas Jefferson. My grandfather was 115 years old when he died. And now I am 101 years old. Some people didn't have no babies when they were slaves. He won't sleep on the floor. Tired here, tired there. Just like a lot of wild people. We didn't know nothing. Didn't like look at no book.
Harriet Smith, remembering what she saw as a small during the final days of the Civil War.
I stood on that picket fence all day long, seeing them soldiers going back to San Antonio and different places. Colored soldiers in Joe. That's right along by our house. Our home is a two-story house.
These recorded memories were among thousands of interviews done with ex-slaves in the 1930s and 40s.
Can you remember slavery days very well?
Of course, I remember all our white folks, and all the names of them, all the children. Call every one of the children's names.
Who did you belong to?
Jim Bunton, the baby boy.
The results of these digitally enhanced recordings are arresting, almost unbelievable. The idea of hearing the voices of actual slaves from the plantations of the Old South is as powerful, as startling, really, as if you could hear Abraham Lincoln or Robert E. Lee speak. Listen again to Fountain Hughes, who was born in 1848.
We were slaves. We belonged to people. They sell us like they sell horses and cows and hogs and all like that. Have an auction bench, and they put you up on the bench and bid on you. The same as bidding on cattle, you know.
Much of what these three former slaves say may at first seem unremarkable. Much of what they say may surprise and upset, and their calm demeanor is at odds with the evil and violence we associate with slavery. Here is 91-year-old Texan Laura Smalley talking in the 1940s about the outcome of a tussle between two women, one black, one white, one slave, one mistress. The mistress tried to slap the slave, but the black woman pushed her into a chair. Laura Smalley was a girl at the time, but she remembers vividly what happened to the black woman when the master came home.
But the thing that old woman told old woman carried in the peach orchard and whipped her. And, just tied her hand this way, around the peach orchard tree. I remember that just as well looked like to me, I can. And around the tree and whipped her. Well, she couldn't do nothing but just kick her feet, just kick her feet. but it just had a clothes off down to a waist, you know. It didn't have a plumb naked, but they had a clothes down to a waist. And every now and then they'd football, you know, and then snuff the pipe out on it, you know. Snuff the pipe out on it. You know the embers in the pipe. Where you ever see the pipe smoking?
Blowing out on it?
Mm-hmm.
Good Lord.
Mm-hmm.
The plantation on which Smalley was a slave sounds brutal. She recalls scrambling with other children for food from a huge wooden tray, like a hog trough.
All of them, you know, would get around that tree with spoons and eat something like mush or soup or something like that. And all them children get around there and just eat.
Fountain Hughes tells his interviewer about the relentless round of work for him on a Virginia plantation.
The night never comes out. You have nothing to do. Time to cut tobacco. If they want you to cut all night long, have them to you cut. And if they want you to hang all night long, you hang tobacco. It didn't matter about your tired, being tired, you're afraid to say you're tired.
It was cotton, not tobacco, that solidified slavery, though. The invention of the cotton gin at the end of the 18th century made its processing easy, but the crop still needed enormous amounts of unskilled labor. Control of the slave and his labor through laws and regulations became paramount. Fountain Hughes talks about one of those controls, the pass system.
Now, I couldn't go from here across the street, or I couldn't go to nobody's house without I have a note or something from my master. And if I had that pass, that's what we call a pass. If I had that pass, I could go wherever he sent me, and I'd have to be back. Whoever he sent me to, they'd give me another pass, and I'd bring that back, so to show how long.
Even emancipation didn't truly free the slaves. Freedom freed slaves for more travail. The end of the Civil War found many cast adrift without skills and no place to go. And the Yankees who freed them weren't always seen as benevolent liberators.
I remember when the Yankees came along and took all the good horses and sold all the meat and flour and sugar and stuff out in the river and let it go down the river. And they knew that people wouldn't have nothing to live on, but they done that.
The ex-slaves left one hell for another, perhaps an even more dangerous one. No longer property, they didn't have the protections afforded property.
When we were slaves, we couldn't do that. See? And as we got free, we didn't know nothing to do. And my mother, she hunted places and bound us out for $1 a month, but we didn't have no property, we didn't have no home, we had nowhere, nothing, we didn't have nothing on it, just like the cattle, just turned out and get along the best you could.
In Texas, the slaves weren't told they were free until 2 months after the war ended. Smalley remembers that her masters gave the slaves a dinner, and then they were free.
I don't hide the other side of the folks, freedom. We didn't know. They just thought, just feeding us, Them didn't know where to go. You see, after freedom, just like he turned something out, They didn't know where to go. That's just where they stayed. Mm-hmm. Didn't know where to go. Turned us out just like, you turn out cattle.
In the narratives, the slaves used an interesting phrase for the end of slavery. They say, when the break came. Good times, easy times were not at hand. The trials for millions of black Americans didn't end in 1865. They continued. Laura Smalley and her family became sharecroppers. Harriet Smith's first husband was killed by whites during the Reconstruction, probably because of his political organizing. Fountain Hughes went north to Baltimore and worked at numerous jobs, including hauling manure. Not an enviable job, but it was the job of a free man.
Well, all right. Just want to let you know where we come from here. Let's never forget. Don't let them forget either. where that came, how we got here, how we were treated, and why we haven't maybe progressed as much as others who immigrated here. Because you see, after all that time, those who immigrated here were able to blend in to the culture, and they were white. They looked white, most of them. The thing that we had was our color, and so they could always look at us and know who to discriminate against. And that's much hasn't changed. I mean, if we look at where we were at the end of the Civil War and the things that we weren't able to get, we want to have the pride, of course, in our accomplishments. But understand this: we have a long way to go because systematic racism, as you see, and there have been, or throughout this month, we're going to focus on some of our black heroes, and to get from them, from their own mouths, as to their struggles and all that, and how things may not have changed as much as you think they have changed. And of course, the one, there's, I don't think there's been a leader in with the I guess I would say in one man that was as important to us as Martin Luther King. And some people say, well, you have Frederick Douglass. I understand that, very important. You have W.B. Du Bois, and on down the line. But as to one person who was causing so much of a struggle in white society and all that, as they saw what he was trying to do and all that, they could focus all of their ire on Martin Luther King. And some people say, well, what about Malcom X and all that? And we're going to hear from Malcom X. But understand, they weren't as worried about Malcom X because they knew that Malcom X, at least in his earlier years, and a lot of those that wanted to have violence and all that they easily could knock them down. They kill them, imprison them, and all that. And actually, they'd rather have you come that way than the way Martin was coming with the nonviolence. And so, the first one we want to emphasize here is Martin. And I want to show you a video from Martin that it's not black and white, it's color. And I think that's important too, because a lot of times when people see the black and white, oh, that was so long ago, and all that kind of thing, and it kind of looks like that when you look at it. But it wasn't that long ago. And I'll tell you how it's not so long ago is because my grandmother, I could reach out and touch her. I remember touching her and all that. She could reach out and touch her mother, who was a slave. I touched my grandmother, she touched her mother. It wasn't that long ago, okay? And let's not forget that there are people out there now, the white supremacists and all that, who would like to push us back to where they think we should be. So let's hear from Martin. And some people haven't heard Martin like this. They always hear in his sermons and things like this, but I think this is significant.
Civil Rights, King, Vanoka, roll 20, sound 36.
Dr. King, this church is as good a place as any to go back over your commitment to the civil rights movement. When you went out from here into university and then you went to Montgomery, Alabama and started the bus boycotts there, what was the philosophy of the civil rights movement as you saw it then, more than 10 years ago?
Well, I would say then the philosophy was that we must go all out to use legal and nonviolent methods to gain full citizenship rights for the Negro people of our country. Now, of course, that particular struggle and that philosophy centered on breaking down all of the barriers of legal segregation. So I would say that in that period, the basic thrust for the gaining of citizenship rights for Negroes was to end the humiliation surrounding the whole system of legal segregation.
Dr. King, was there something peculiar to the place where you started and the kind of people you attracted? I mean by that, there was a strong attachment on the part of your parishioners in Montgomery to the church. They were older people, weren't they?
Yes, I would say by and large they were older people who participated in the boycott because they were the ones using the bus more than anybody else. And Montgomery was a community predominantly church-centered, so that it was very easy to get to the vast majority of Negroes because they were in some way connected with a church in the community.
Was there, in addition to your commitment to the idea of nonviolence, wasn't it also the only thing you could do, the white community having the monopoly on violence, that if you had tried violence, they would have met it with violence? It was the only device open to you, wasn't it?
Well, I'll put it another way, that morally, I was led to nonviolence because I felt that it was the best moral way to deal with the problem. We were seeking to establish a just society. And it was my feeling then, and it is my feeling now, that violence is certainly much more socially destructive, and it creates many more social problems than it solves. So I was led to nonviolence for deep moral reasons. Now, there is no doubt about the fact that in our struggle in Montgomery and all over the United States for that matter, nonviolence is also practically sound. It would just be impractical for the Negro to turn to violence. He has neither the instruments nor the techniques of violence. We're about 10 or 11% of the total population of the nation, and I would say we're about 1/10 of the firepower. So it would just be totally impractical and unwise and unrealistic for the Negro to think of violence. Well, I saw this in the beginning in Montgomery, but this wasn't the basic reason that I turned to nonviolence and that I believed in it as a philosophy. I turned to it because I felt that it was the morally excellent way to deal with the problem of racial injustice in our country.
Is there something about nonviolence that made it, and I use that in the past tense, that made it more useful among Southern Negroes than the ghetto Negroes of the North?
I wouldn't say there's anything that makes it more useful to Southern Negroes. I think it is true that we've had more nonviolent movements in the South because the problem for many years was more crystallized and, in a sense, more visible in the South. We didn't have many civil rights activities on a massive scale in the North until 3 or 4 years ago. So I would say that we just haven't had a chance to experiment on a broad scale with nonviolence in the Northern Ghetto. I have the feeling that nonviolence is as applicable and workable in the Northern Ghetto as it is in the South. Now, there's a larger job there. The frustrations at points are much deeper. The bitterness is deeper. And I think that's because in the South we can see pockets of progress here and there. We've really made some strides that are very visible, and every Southern Negro knows that he can do things today that he couldn't do 4 or 5 years ago. Wherein in the North, the Negro sees only retrogress, and he doesn't find it as easy to get his vision centered on his target, the target of opposition, as he does in the South. consequently, this is made for despair and at many points cynicism, a feeling that you can't win. And it simply means that we've got to develop in the North a massive job of organization and mobilizing forces and resources to deal with the problem in the urban ghettos of the North, just as we've done it in the South.
In the South, particularly in Alabama, you had visible villains. Jim Clark, Bull Connor, cattle prods, police dogs. But in the North, you don't have those visible villains. Isn't it hard to get your people aroused and directed at something that isn't visible?
Well, that's exactly right, and this is what I was saying when I said it's harder to see a target. In the South, in the nonviolent movement, we were aided always, on the whole, by the brutality of our opponent. It isn't the same way in the North. The other thing is that you don't have legal segregation in the North as you do in the South. So it is much more difficult to get people to see exactly what you're doing, but it isn't an impossible job. It's a hard, it's a tedious job at times to get people to be aroused from their apathetic slumbers, but I still feel that Negroes in the North can be motivated just as they were motivated in the South. And I think as time goes on with the growing economic deprivation in the Negro community, it will even be easier because people will come to see that not only is something wrong in general, but something is wrong in particular in their own economic and housing situations.
Well, what is it? I mean, how do you find it? It's very subtle in the North, is it not?
It's subtle, but it's becoming much more visible. Anybody can see that the schools are more segregated in the North today than they were in 1954 when the Supreme Court rendered its decision declaring segregation unconstitutional. Anybody can look around the ghetto and see that ghetto schools are predominantly segregated and devoid of quality. Anyone who moves through a major ghetto of our country will see the housing conditions. People don't have to be reminded that they are forced to live in slums in many instances, and they're often rat-infested, vermin-filled slums. And it isn't too hard to see the exploitation that the Negro confronts in the ghetto, where he is forced to pay more for less and constantly trying to make ends meet, but because of either no job as a result of unemployment or a job that is so economically unprofitable that the person can't make ends meet. And I think they see all of these things, and more they're coming to see them, because before the people of the North were looking to the South and they supported the struggles of the South. Now they're coming to see that their problems are very real and they've got organized to grapple with them.
Was there something hypocritical about the fact that the South existed and the North could point the finger, and then when the Civil Rights Acts were passed in the early 60s, you couldn't point the finger anymore?
Well, there was no doubt about the hypocrisy of large segments of the nation on the whole question of racial equality. I think the best example is that many of the senators from the North and the West, and congressmen generally, who voted for civil rights legislation in 64 and even in 65 with the Voting Rights Bill, refused last year to vote for civil rights legislation because it dealt with an issue applicable to the North, the whole housing question. And this, it seems to me, was the greatest expression of the hypocrisy of many of our citizens and many of the senators and congressmen of the North.
But isn't that part of the dilemma now? That people knew that Negroes were being denied what was guaranteed to them by the Constitution, by the fact that they were citizens of this country. Then when they were given those rights, do you feel the white community said, well, we've given them all that we have, now it's up to them?
Well, I think the dilemma is much deeper, and I think one during this period of transition has to be very honest with America. and honesty impels me to admit that America has broad racist elements still alive. Racism is still existing in American society in many areas of the society, North and South. And the other thing is that there has never been a single, solid, determined commitment of large segments of white America on the whole question of racial equality. I think we have to see that vacillation has always existed, ambivalence has always existed, and this to me is the so-called white backlash. It's merely a new name for an old phenomenon. I see the white backlash as a continuation of the same ambivalence and vacillation of white America on the whole question of racial justice that has existed since the founding of our nation. I think the other thing that we must see at this time is that many of the people who supported us in Selma, in Birmingham, were really outraged about the extremist behavior toward Negroes. But they were not at that moment, and they are not now, committed to genuine equality for Negroes. It's much easier to integrate a lunch counter than it is to guarantee an annual income, for instance, to get rid of poverty for Negroes and all poor people. It's much easier to integrate a bus than it is to make genuine integration a reality and quality education a reality in our schools. It's much easier to integrate even a public park than it is to get rid of slums. And I think we are in a new era, a new phase of the struggle, where we have moved from a struggle for decency, which characterized our struggle for 10 or 12 years, to a struggle for genuine equality. And this is where we are getting the resistance, because there was never any intention to go this far. People were reacting to Bull Connor and to Jim Clark rather than acting in good faith for the realization of genuine equality.
Do you think white people in this country, and I'm talking about non-segregationists, people devoid or thinking they're devoid of racism, do you have any idea of what they want the Negro to be in America?
Well, it depends on the level that we are talking here, because I think you have to make a distinction between the people who are genuinely and absolutely committed in the white community on the question of racial equality. And I must confess that I think they're in a very small minority. I think the vast majority of white Americans will go but so far. It's a kind of installment plan for equality. And they are always looking for an excuse to go but so far.
Why are they looking for the excuse? What is it about the Negro? I mean, every other group that came as an immigrant somehow, not easily, but somehow got around it. Is it just the fact that Negroes are black?
That's a part of it, and that grows out of something else. You can't thingify anything without depersonalizing that something. If you use something as a means to an end, at that moment you make it a thing and you depersonalize it. The fact is that the Negro was a slave in this country for 244 years. That was a willful thing that was done. The Negro was brought here and changed, treated in very inhuman fashion. And this led to the thingification of the Negro. So he was not looked upon as a person. He was not looked upon as a human being with the same status and worth as other human beings. And the other thing is that human beings cannot continue to do wrong without eventually rationalizing that wrong. So slavery was justified morally, biologically, theoretically, scientifically, everything else. And it seems to me that white America must see that no other ethnic group has been a slave on American soil. That is one thing that other immigrant groups haven't had to face. The other thing is that the color became a stigma. American society made the Negro's color a stigma. And that can never be overlooked. So I think these things are absolutely necessary. The other thing is that America freed the slaves in 1863 through the Emancipation Proclamation of Abraham Lincoln, but gave the slaves no land or nothing in reality, and as a matter of fact, to get started on. At the same time, America was giving away millions of acres of land in the West and the Midwest, which meant that there was a willingness to give the white peasants from Europe an economic base. And yet it refused to give its black peasants from Africa, who came here involuntarily in chains and had worked free for 244 years, any kind of economic base. And so emancipation for the Negro was really freedom to hunger. It was freedom to the winds and rains of heaven. It was freedom without food to eat or land to cultivate, and therefore it was freedom and famine at the same time. And when white Americans tell the Negro to lift himself by his own bootstraps, they don't look over the legacy of slavery and segregation. I believe we ought to do all we can and seek to lift ourselves by our own bootstraps, but it's a cruel jest to say to a bootless man that he ought to lift himself by his own bootstraps. And many Negroes, by the thousands and millions, have been left bootless as a result of all of these years of oppression and as a result of a society that deliberately made his color a stigma and something worthless and degrading.
Apart from wanting to live better, which all of us want to do, to raise one's children in a better way, to be better, does the Negro in America know what he wants to be?
I'm convinced that almost every Negro in this country, other than those who have been so scarred by the system that they've become pathological in the process, and we all have to battle with pathology, and nobody really knows what it means to be a Negro unless one can really experience it. And I know we all have to battle with this constant drain of a feeling of nobodiness. But in spite of this, I think the vast majority of Negroes in this country know that they want to be people, they want to be men, they want equality, period. It just boils down to that. And we haven't been able to be people. We haven't been men because of all of the conditions that we've lived with and the syndrome of deprivation surrounding conditions, whether it's in housing, or in the economic area, or in schools, or in the vicious credit practices that we face in the ghetto, and all of the problems of closed doors and constant defeats. But in spite of all this, I think we all know, basically, that we want to be men. We want to be persons judged not on the basis of the color of our skin, but on the basis of the content of our character.
But you know that many young Negroes don't want anything that smacks the American white middle class. But do they want something that smacks of whatever is the black middle class, or do they just not want bourgeois values, which after all are the basis of this democracy?
Well, I think we have to see what they are saying. I would be the first to agree that integration does not mean giving up everything that has an Afro-American taint, so to speak, a background. I think there are certain unique things within any culture and certain cultural patterns that when you get to the process of amalgamation can really lift the whole culture. It seems to me that integration at its best is the opportunity to participate in the beauty of diversity. I think the other thing that we've got to see is that these young people are saying that there must be a revolution of values in our country. As Jimmy Baldwin said on one occasion, what advantage is there in being integrated into a burning house? And I feel that there is a need for a revolution of values in America, because some of the values that presently exist are certainly out of line with the values and the idealistic structure that brought our nation into being. Unfortunately, we haven't been true to these ideals, and many of the values of so-called white middle-class society are values that need to be reviewed and re-evaluated, and in a real sense, they need to be changed. So I think the young people in the Negro community who are raising these questions are raising some very profound questions about our total society. In other words, they are saying that there must be a restructuring of the architecture of our society where values are concerned. And with this, I would agree with. So in the quest for integration, I think we can offer our whole nation something, because there are three evils in our nation. It's not only racism, but economic exploitation of poverty would be one, and then militarism. And I think in a sense, and in a very real sense, these three are tied inextricably together, and we aren't going to get rid of one without getting rid of the other.
When you stood on the Lincoln Memorial that day in August '63, and you said, "I had a dream," did that dream envision that you could see a war in Asia preventing the federal government doing for the Negroes, preventing the society doing for the Negroes, that which you think had to be done?
No, I didn't envision that then. I must confess that that period was a great period of hope for me. And I'm sure for many others all across the nation, many of the Negroes who had about lost hope, saw a solid decade of progress in the South. And in 1954, which was, 64, 1963, 9 years after the Supreme Court's decision to be in the March on Washington, meant a great deal. It was a high moment, a great watershed moment. But I must confess that that dream that I had that day has at many points turned into a nightmare. Now, I'm not one to lose hope. I keep on hoping. I still have faith in the future. But I've had to analyze many things over the last few years, and I would say over the last few months. I've gone through a lot of soul-searching and agonizing moments. And I've come to see that we have many more difficult days ahead, and some of the old optimism was a little superficial, and now it must be tempered with a solid realism. And I think the realistic fact is that we still have a long, long way to go, and that we are involved in a war on Asian soil, which, if not checked and stopped, can poison the very soul of our nation.
Dr. King, even if there had not been a war in Asia, would you still not have had this nightmare insofar as the Negro movement for equality then touched on two things that the white community holds sacred: their children and their property?
Oh, I have no doubt that we would have encountered great difficulties, great problems of resistance, if the war had not been in existence. So that I'm not going to say that all of our problems would be solved if the war in Vietnam is ended. But I do say that the war makes it infinitely more difficult to deal with these problems. When a nation becomes obsessed with the guns of war, it loses its social perspective, and programs of social uplift suffer. This is just a fact of history, so that we do face many more difficulties as a result of the war. It's much more difficult to really arouse a conscience during a time of war. I noticed the other day, some weeks ago, a Negro was shot down in Chicago, and it was a clear case of police brutality. That was on page 30 of the paper, but on page 1 at the top was 780 Viet Cong killed. That is something about a war like this that makes people insensitive. It dulls the conscience. It strengthens the forces of reaction, and it brings into being bitterness and hatred and violence, and it strengthened the military-industrial complex of our country, and it's made our job much more difficult, because I think we can go along with some programs, if we didn't have this war on our hands, that would cause people to adjust to new developments, just as they did in the South. They said they'd never ride the bus with us. Blood would flow in the streets. They wouldn't go to school and all of these things. But when people came to see that they had to do it because the law insisted, they finally adjusted. And I think white people all over this country will adjust once the nation makes it clear that in schools, in housing, we've got to learn to live together as brothers. I think the biggest problem now is that we got our gains over the last 12 years at bargain rate, so to speak. Didn't cost the nation anything. In fact, it helped the economic side of the nation to integrate lunch counters and public accommodations. It didn't cost the nation anything to get the right to vote established. And now we are confronting issues that cannot be solved without costing the nation billions of dollars. Now, I think this is where we're getting our greatest resistance. They may put it on many other things, but we can't get rid of slums and poverty without it costing the nation something.
All right. Hey, how about that?
Hey, NBC News viewers.
What year was that, honey?
That was 11 months before he was assassinated, so that would have been 1967. And I wanted, and I know that was a rather long video. However, I think it's important. Like I said, one thing, it's in color, so that people don't look at it as being like ancient history. But the other thing is, we talk about Martin Luther King and all that kind of thing, and we have his birthday and all that. But not many people understand what was going on in his head as he was progressing through this civil rights movement. This video, we got a chance to get up close and personal with Martin, and I think hopefully you understand him a little better than you did before. Or maybe it just brings you back to understanding him as you did before. But one thing I think when I was listening to that video is that his passion and his standing on the truth of what was going on at that time. And remember what I've said before is that every now and then, every few years, we get another awakening where we rise up and demand our rights and all that kind of thing. And the reason I said he was one of the most consequential of our leaders is that once he was assassinated, that put a lot of that movement down again. And there's never been another leader that's come up and had the, how would you say, the power and the message that he's had that's been able to move a substantial amount of our people in a certain way. It's just, it hasn't happened. So basically that assassination put us back a long way. But now we understand, or you understand from watching that, a lot of the things that he was going through, what he stood for. And the question I asked when I first went into this is, how much of it has changed?
Well, Sister Monica said, wow, not much progress. And I was listening to the things that he was saying in that video in 1967, and I was saying, I'll be daggone. We still need to do this.
Yes, we do.
We still need to have, social equality, economic equality, housing equality, education equality. That's really stunning.
And that's where he was planning on taking the movement. And I thought
that's why they killed him too.
Yeah, and I thought it was very significant that he mentioned a black man in Chicago who was shot down by the police as a clear proof of police brutality. Are we not still going through that?
We are still going through that. We are still going through that.
I call that the stand in the gap moment because, as I've always said, the stand in the gap moment is, standing in the gap itself is standing on the truth. Stand on the truth. It's Black History Month. I think we need to stand on the truth, and we need to make sure that we understand where we've been to understand where we need to go. Where we need to go. All right, Black History. Let's see what Malcolm has to say here.
Tonight, Front Page Challenge welcomes the outspoken Negro leader, Malcom X.
Sir, what's the real reason why you two men split? Is it merely ideological, or is it personality? What else?
Probably personality. It was not the statement that originally was given by the movement when we split. More personality than anything else.
You've called people like Martin Luther King, who just got a Nobel Peace Prize, an Uncle Tom. Is this correct, first?
Well, I'd rather say that in the States, there's a law that has recently been passed, or a decision handed down by the court, where if you call someone an Uncle Tom, they can sue you for libel.
Well,
so I never refer to them as Uncle Tom. I would say that Uncle Martin is my friend.
Uncle Martin is your friend, yet you would disagree with his approach to what he wants to accomplish.
Definitely. If his approach would bring about what the black man in America needs to completely eliminate the problem that we have, I would say well and good. But I very much doubt that anyone who adopts the approach that Martin Luther King has been teaching to our people in that country can point to any meaningful gains that has actually served to solve the problem.
Black Muslims have sometimes, whether you have or not, and I think probably you have sometimes, it seemed to me, been preaching hate to meet hate.
I don't advocate any kind of hate.
There's a lot of talk that sounds very much like it.
No, I think that the guilt complex of the American white man is so profound until when you begin to analyze the real condition of the black man in America, instead of the American white man eliminating the causes that create that condition, he tries to cover it up by accusing his accusers of teaching hate. But actually, they're just exposing him for being responsible for what exists.
Well, that's something of an argument, but I've heard speeches made by some of the people of your group. I think I've heard you make speeches. It seemed to me that you were advocating what I would have to describe, I think, as violence to meet the serious injuries that have been done your people, with which I totally agree.
I don't call that violence. I don't in any way encourage black people to go out and initiate acts of aggression indiscriminately against whites. But I do believe that the black man in the United States and any human being, anywhere, is well within his right to do whatever is necessary, by any means necessary, to protect his life and property, especially in a country where the federal government itself has proven that it is either unable or unwilling to protect the lives and property of those human beings.
Just before Pierre takes it, you've got a pretty good fighter and the world's heavyweight champion lined up with you to help out. Yes, Pierre.
Well, Mr. X, I guess I call you that. Is that the proper appellation,
yes.
Mr. X? I'm wondering if you still believe, and I think you certainly did at the time you were allied to the Black Muslim movement, in a segregated black nation in North America.
I don't believe in any form of segregation or any form of racism. I'm against any form of segregation and against racism.
Am I right in saying that the Black Muslim movement, which you have left, did believe in that?
Well, Elijah Muhammad taught his followers that the only solution was a separate state for black people. And as long as I thought he genuinely believed that himself, I believed in him and believed in his solution. But when I began to doubt that he himself believed that that was feasible, and I saw no kind of action designed to bring it into existence or bring it about, then I turned in a different direction.
Are you still a Muslim yourself?
Oh, yes. I'm a Muslim. I believe in the religion of Islam, which believes in brotherhood, complete brotherhood of all people. But at the same time that I believe in this brotherhood, I don't believe in forcing my desire for brotherhood upon those who aren't willing to accept it.
Of course, I think the Christians would say that they also believed in brotherhood. What did you say to that?
I'd say they believe in it, but don't practice it.
That'd be a pretty good answer.
Sir, when the muezzin goes up in the minaret twice a day, he cries to the world, there is but one God, and he is Allah. Do you deny that there is a Christian God?
The muezzin does this 5 times a day.
5 times, and I only heard him twice.
Well, you were fortunate to hear him twice. But he does this 5 times a day, and the same God that he says that he expresses the existence of is the God that the Christians profess to believe in themselves, and the God that the Jews believe in. One God, the creator of the universe. The Muslims believe in the God that created the universe, and I think the Christians do, and the Jews do. Now, as long as all of them are talking about the creator, the Jews may call him Jehovah, and Christians may have another name for him. Those who are Arabic-speaking refer to him as Allah. Well, we believe in the same God.
Now, as the Muslim religion advances in the United States, are you modernizing it or sticking with the old faiths? For example, the complete segregation of the sexes?
I think that everything today on this earth is being modernized. Religious principles and practices, as well as political and other things.
Now, when you went to Mecca, this is a very sacred and forbidden city. I tried to get to Mecca myself and certainly didn't make it, not being a Muslim. But how would they accept you as one? You're an American. There are few American Muslims.
This is true, and by being an American and not having not being able to speak the Arabic language, I did strike a snag, a very serious snag, but I was fortunate to have been pretty well known by the officials in Arabia, and they knew too that I had accepted Orthodox Islam. It had been highly publicized in the paper, and I became a guest of the state. I was a guest of Prince Faisal, the present King Faisal, and they made it possible for me to go before the committee, Hajj committee or Hajj court, who examines you and asks you questions about your belief, and if you pass it, then you are okay to go to Mecca. But
you would have to have a translator then.
I had one. Then realizing that our problem in America, that we are black Americans, and we have a problem that goes beyond religion, we formed a group known as the Organization of Afro-American Unity. And the objective of this organization is non-religious, number one. Any Negro can belong to it. And the objective of that organization is to bring about a condition that will guarantee respect and recognition of the 22 million black Americans as human beings. We feel that the problem, number one, of the black man in America is beyond America's ability to solve. It's a human problem, not an American problem or a Negro problem. And as a human problem or a world problem, we feel that it should be taken out of the jurisdiction of the United States government and the United States courts and taken into the United Nations in the same manner that the problems of the black man in South Africa, Angola, and other parts of the world, and even the way they're trying to bring the problems of the Jews in Russia into the United Nations because of violation of human rights. We believe that our problem is one not of violation of civil rights, but a violation of human rights. Not only are we denied the right to be a citizen in the United States, we're denied the right to be a human being.
Mr. X, may I thank you very much for coming on our program and perhaps clearing away some of the cobwebs of misconception that some of us might have had about your belief. And I think you're a very sincere man, and it takes a lot of courage to admit a former belief is wrong, and we congratulate you for that and the service you performed tonight in giving us your views. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Well, all right. Now, that would have been his interview after he split with the Honorable... I mean, I guess he's an honorable.
Well, it's just like somebody saying I'm the bishop or I'm the apostle. That's the name he gave himself.
Well, and the only reason I said that is because Malcolm, one of the reasons he split, or some of the reason he split was because he didn't think that Elijah was all that honorable as he was professing to be. So we're going to get into that next week. All through this month, we're going to be highlighting certain aspects of black history.
And come back to the live stream for the links to these videos.